They sold every daughter at auction, 7 sisters one by one, until only Emma remained on that courthouse platform. What happened next changed an entire town's understanding of human dignity. This is the story of Daniel Hayes, a broken widower, who stepped forward when no one else would, and the young Irish woman whose courage would transform them both forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Millbrook's cobblestone square, like shame itself, refusing to lift despite the October sun's weak attempts to burn it away. Daniel Hayes stood at the edge of the gathered crowd, his carpenter's hands buried deep in coat, pockets worn thin from 2 years of neglect. He hadn't intended to witness this spectacle. He'd only come to town for nails and perhaps another bottle to chase away the memories that haunted his empty cabin each night. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. The sound of the auctioneer's voice carried across the square like a church bell calling sinners to account. Cornelius Whitman stood on the courthouse steps, his voice booming with practiced authority, gesturing toward a young woman who stood with her back straight as a ship's mast, despite the circumstances that had brought her there. Daniel had heard whispers about the Sullivan family, Irish refugees who'd arrived on the last ship before winter, carrying nothing but grief and desperate hope. The potato blight had taken everything from them, just as it had from thousands of others fleeing across the Atlantic in coffin ships that barely deserved the name. Patrick Sullivan had buried his wife at sea, somewhere between Cork and Philadelphia, left alone with 7 daughters and no means to feed them in a country that viewed his kind as little better than cattle. The crowd gathered around the courthouse. Steps represented the full spectrum of Millbrook society. Mill owners in fine wool coats stood alongside workers in patched jackets, their breath visible in the cold air. Women clutched their shawls tighter, some with pity in their eyes, others with barely concealed disgust at the spectacle before them. The Irish families huddled together near the back, their faces etched with the particular grief that comes from watching your own kind suffer while being powerless to help. Emma Sullivan stood on the platform like a queen in exile. At 17, she possessed a bearing that spoke of education and refinement, unusual for someone in her circumstances. Her dark hair had been plaited simply, and though her dress was worn thin from the ocean crossing, she wore it with dignity that no amount of hardship could diminish. In her hands, she clutched a small silver locket, the only possession she had. Left from the life she'd known before hunger drove her family from their homeland. This was the 7th auction in as many weeks. Daniel had heard about the others from Mrs. Murphy, who ran the boarding house where the Irish families stayed. Mary, the eldest at 22, had been purchased by a farming family 50 miles north. Bridget went to a textile mill in Lancaster, Margaret to a wealthy household in Philadelphia where she would work as a kitchen maid. Catherine, Anne, and young Nora, barely 13, had all found themselves bound by indenture contracts to families who needed strong backs and willing hands. Now, only Emma remained, and the crowd's discomfort was palpable. She was different from her sisters, and everyone knew it. Where they had been quiet and submissive, accepting their fate with resigned grace, Emma had made her opinions known. She could read and write, unusual for any woman of her station, and she'd made the mistake of correcting the terms of a contract during one of the earlier auctions. Word had spread quickly through Millbrook's tight-knit community about the Irish girl who thought herself too good for honest work. Whitman cleared his throat and gestured toward Emma with the casual manner of a man selling livestock. Here we have Emma Sullivan, age 17, last of the Sullivan daughters. Fine breeding stock, if you will, healthy constitution proven by survival of the Atlantic crossing. Can read and write, though some might consider that more burden than blessing in household management. No debts, no diseases, comes with 4 years of indenture as specified by Pennsylvania labor law. The auctioneer's words hung in the morning air like smoke from the mill's great chimney. Several men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, their wives tugging at their sleeves in disapproval. Daniel watched as Emma's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Her eyes swept the crowd with a mixture of defiance and barely contained fear, though she held her composure with remarkable strength. Now then, Whitman continued, consulting the papers in his hand, bidding will start at $20 for the 4-year contract. She's strong, willing to work, and those who've employed her sisters speak well of their character. Though this one does have particular opinions about her circumstances. A murmur rippled through the crowd at this last comment. Everyone present understood the implication. Emma Sullivan was trouble, the kind of servant who might read the newspapers and develop ideas above her station. In a town where the social order depended on everyone knowing their place, such independence was viewed with suspicion. Minutes passed in uncomfortable silence. A few men exchanged glances, but no hands rose. The mill workers couldn't afford $20 for an indenture contract, and the wealthier families had already decided that Emma Sullivan's reputation preceded her. Mrs. Ashford, wife of the mill owner, whispered something to her husband that made him shake his head firmly. Even the farmers, who might have benefited from literate help, seemed reluctant to take on someone who might challenge their authority. Daniel found himself studying Emma's face during the prolonged silence. There was something in her expression that reminded him of Sarah, his late wife, during the early days of their courtship, when she defied her father's wishes to walk out with a carpenter instead of the banker's son. Sarah had possessed that same combination of vulnerability and steel, that refusal to bend even when circumstances demanded it. The memory struck him with unexpected force. Sarah had been gone for 2 years now, taken by the same fever that claimed their infant son 3 days later. Daniel had built their cabin with his own hands, crafted every piece of furniture with love and anticipation for the family they would raise together. Now those rooms stood empty, filled only with dust and the echo of dreams that would never be realized. As the silence stretched on, Emma's composure began to show small cracks. Her fingers tightened around the locket, and Daniel could see the slight tremor in her hands that she was trying so hard to control. Here was a young woman who had already lost everything, watched her sisters disappear one by one into uncertain futures, and now faced the possibility that even indentured servitude might be denied her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Come now," Whitman called out, his professional joviality beginning to strain. "Surely someone can see the value here. She's young, healthy, can manage household accounts better than most. $20 for 4 years of service, that's less than $5 per year." Still, no one moved. Daniel caught sight of Victor Ashford, near the front of the crowd, the mill owner's youngest son, whose reputation for cruelty toward the Irish workers was well known throughout Millbrook. Victor was watching Emma with an expression that made Daniel's stomach turn. The look of a man evaluating property rather than acknowledging a human being. There were stories about Victor, whispered accounts of how he treated the young women who worked in his father's mill, stories that decent people didn't repeat in polite company. The auctioneer tried once more, his voice taking on a note of desperation. $15 then. Surely someone recognizes a bargain when they see one. Look at that bearing, that dignity. She'd make a fine addition to any household, and her Education means she could help with correspondence, bookkeeping. Emma's eyes found Daniel's across the crowd, and for a moment time seemed suspended. He saw in her gaze a flash of the same desperate hope he'd felt when the doctor examined Sarah during those final days, the look of someone clinging to the possibility that someone, somewhere, might step forward and change everything. But there was also resignation there, the acceptance that hope was often a luxury people in her position couldn't afford. That's when Victor Ashford raised his hand. $5, he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the square. But only for personal service, not household work. The implication in his words sent a chill through the crowd. Several women gasped audibly, and even some of the men looked uncomfortable with the suggestion. Emma went pale, her hand instinctively moving to her throat as if she could feel invisible chains tightening around her neck. Whitman hesitated, clearly recognizing the impropriety of the offer, but also facing the reality that no other bids had materialized. Mr. Ashford, the contract specifies standard household service, as regulated by Pennsylvania law. Victor's smile was cold and predatory. Laws can be interpreted flexibly when it comes to managing one's property effectively. I'm sure Miss Sullivan would prove quite manageable with proper guidance. The silence that followed was different from before, heavy with the weight of moral cowardice and social complicity. Everyone present understood what Victor was suggesting, and their willingness to let it proceed spoke volumes about how little value they placed on Emma Sullivan's humanity. Daniel felt something snap inside his chest, a sound like dry kindling finally catching fire. Without conscious thought, his hand rose into the air, and his voice carried across the square with the authority of a man who'd found his purpose again after 2 years of drifting. $50, he said clearly, for full legal marriage, not indenture. The crowd turned toward him as one, their faces displaying varying degrees of shock, confusion, and outrage. Marriage was not what anyone had expected to hear, least of all from Daniel Hayes, the grieving widower who'd become something of a hermit since his wife's death. But there he stood, his carpenter's frame solid and unyielding, his eyes fixed not on the crowd, but on Emma herself. Whitman nearly dropped his papers. Mr. Hayes, I'm not sure you understand the proceedings here. This is an indenture auction, not a matrimonial service. I understand perfectly, Daniel replied, his voice steady despite the way his heart was hammering against his ribs. Pennsylvania law allows for marriage as an alternative to indenture servitude for unmarried women over 16. I'm offering marriage and citizenship, not bondage. Emma stared at him with an expression of complete bewilderment. Here was a man she'd never spoken to, offering her something she'd never dared to hope for. Freedom, not just from the auction block, but from the entire system that had reduced her and her sisters to commodities to be bought and sold. Her lips moved soundlessly, as if she were trying to process words in a language she didn't quite understand. Victor Ashford's face had turned an unpleasant shade of red. This is irregular, Whitman. Marriage proposals have no place in a legal auction. Actually, came a new voice from the crowd, Mr. Hayes is quite correct. Judge William Porter stepped forward, his legal training evident in his careful choice of words. Pennsylvania statute does indeed provide marriage as an alternative to indenture for qualified individuals. If Miss Sullivan consents, and if Mr. Hayes can demonstrate the financial means to support a wife, the law would recognize such a union as superior to any indenture contract. The crowd erupted in whispered conversations, the social implications of this development rippling through Millbrook's carefully maintained hierarchy like stones thrown into still water. An Irish woman marrying into established American society was scandalous enough, but for Daniel Hayes to make such an offer challenged every assumption about proper social order. Daniel never took his eyes off Emma as the legal debate swirled around them. "The choice is yours," he said, his voice somehow carrying clearly despite the crowd's noise. "I won't claim you against your will, but I can offer you a name, a home, and the freedom to make your own decisions about your future." Emma looked down at the locket in her hands, the small silver case that contained the only image she had of her family before the great hunger scattered them across an ocean. When she looked up again, her eyes held a different kind of determination, not the desperate defiance of someone with no options, but the calm resolve of someone who had suddenly found an unexpected path forward. "I accept," she said, her voice clear enough for the entire square to hear. "I accept Daniel Hayes's proposal of marriage." The words hit the crowd like lightning striking dry timber. Some people cheered, mostly the Irish families who saw this as a victory against the system that had torn so many of them apart. Others muttered angrily about disruptions to proper order and the consequences of allowing such precedents. But the loudest voice belonged to Victor Ashford, whose fury at being denied his prize was evident to everyone present. "This is preposterous," he shouted. "Hayes has been drunk more often than sober since his wife died. He's in no condition to support himself, much less a wife. I protest this entire proceeding." Judge Porter raised his hand for silence. "Mr. Ashford, the law is quite clear. If Mr. Hayes can demonstrate financial solvency and Miss Sullivan consents freely, we have no grounds to prevent this union. Mr. Hayes, do you have the means to support a wife?" Daniel reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch heavy with coins. The money he'd been saving for 2 years, originally intended for improvements to his workshop, but left untouched since Sarah's death because he'd lost all motivation to build anything new. $87.30, he said, pouring the contents into his palm, plus my carpentry business and the cabin with 40 acres. Even Victor Ashford couldn't argue with such clear evidence of financial stability. Judge Porter nodded approvingly. "More than sufficient. Miss Sullivan, do you enter into this marriage contract of your own free will, understanding that it will grant you all the rights and protections of an American citizen?" Emma stepped forward, her back still straight, her voice still strong. "I do, Your Honor. I choose marriage over bondage, partnership over servitude." Whitman, clearly flustered by the turn of events, consulted his papers one final time. "Very well, then. By the authority vested in me by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and with Judge Porter as witness, I pronounce Daniel Hayes and Emma Sullivan husband and wife. May God have mercy on both your souls." The crowd began to disperse, some lingering, to offer congratulations, others hurrying away to spread word of the morning's unprecedented events throughout Millbrook. But Daniel and Emma remained on the courthouse steps, two strangers bound together by law and circumstance, each wondering what they had just committed themselves to. "I suppose we should go home," Daniel said finally, offering her his arm with the careful courtesy of a man who understood that everything had changed but wasn't yet sure how. Emma took his arm, her touch light but steady. "Yes," she agreed. "I suppose we should go home." As they walked through Millbrook streets toward Daniel's cabin, neither spoke of the enormous leap of faith they had just taken. Neither acknowledged the stares of their neighbors or the whispered speculation that followed in their wake. Instead, they walked together in careful silence, two broken people who had just chosen hope over despair, dignity over degradation, and an uncertain future over the certain misery that had seemed inevitable just an hour before. The mill's great wheel continued turning, grinding grain into flour with the same relentless rhythm it had maintained for 20 years. But something fundamental had shifted in Millbrook that morning, a change that would ripple through the community's carefully maintained social order like cracks spreading through winter ice. Daniel Hayes and Emma Sullivan, had become Daniel and Emma Hayes, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The walk to Daniel's cabin stretched longer than either had anticipated, winding through Millbrook's muddy streets past workshops and cottages that seemed to lean away from them as they passed. Word traveled faster than their footsteps in a town this size, and by the time they reached the mill district, curtains were already twitching behind windows and conversations halting. Mid-sentence, as neighbors caught sight of the unlikely pair, Emma kept her eyes fixed on the path ahead, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm, more for balance on the uneven cobblestones than from any sense of intimacy. The weight of what had just transpired pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy cloak, and she found herself stealing glances at the man who had just become her husband through a decision that had taken all of 30 seconds to make. Daniel Hayes was not what she had expected when she'd imagined marriage during her girlhood in County Cork. He was older than her by nearly 30 years, his brown hair already showing threads of silver at the temples, and his face bore the deep lines that came from prolonged grief rather than laughter. But there was something solid about him, something that reminded her of the oak trees that had stood sentinel around her family's cottage before the blight took everything they had known. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, merely careful, like two people sharing a narrow bridge who understood that sudden movements might send them both tumbling into the chasm below. Emma found herself cataloguing details about this man who had stepped forward when no one else would. His coat was well made but showing wear, his boots sturdy and practical, his hands marked by countless hours of working with wood and tools. Everything about him spoke of competence and reliability, qualities that had been in short supply during the months of uncertainty that had brought her to that courthouse platform. As they left the town proper behind, the landscape opened into rolling hills dotted with farms and woodland. The October air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, and Emma felt something inside her chest loosen slightly as they moved away from the watching eyes and whispered judgments of Millbrook's residents. The farther they walked from a town, the more the morning's events felt like something that had happened to someone else, a story she had heard rather than lived. Daniel's cabin appeared around a bend in the dirt road, like something from a fairy tale her mother used to tell. It was smaller than she had expected, but beautifully crafted, with careful attention paid to every detail from the stone foundation to the cedar shingles on the roof. A covered porch wrapped around the front and one side, and she could see a separate workshop building behind the main house, its doors standing open to reveal the ordered chaos of a working carpenter's domain. "It's not much," Daniel said, the first words either of them had spoken since leaving the courthouse steps. "But it's sound. Built it myself 5 years ago when Sarah and I—" He stopped abruptly, seeming to realize that mentioning his late wife on his wedding day might not be the most tactful approach. Emma studied the cabin with an eye trained by poverty to assess both opportunity and limitation. The construction was solid, the design practical but pleasing, and she could see evidence of care in every aspect, from the carved shutters to the neat garden plot beside the kitchen door. "It's lovely," she said, and meant it. After months of sleeping in Mrs. Murphy's overcrowded boarding house and before that, the cramped quarters of the ship that had brought them to America, the idea of having a real home again felt almost too good to be true. Daniel pushed open the front door and gestured for her to enter first, a courtesy that struck Emma as both touching and absurd, given the circumstances of their union. She stepped across the threshold into a front room that was clean, but obviously neglected, furnished with pieces that showed Daniel's skill as a craftsman, but arranged with the haphazard practicality of a man who had stopped caring about such things. The main room served as both parlor and dining area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and windows that let in the pale autumn light. A kitchen occupied the back portion of the house, equipped with a cast-iron stove that looked well-maintained. Despite its age, Emma could see two doors leading off the main area, presumably to bedrooms, and a ladder that led to what was likely a storage loft above. "There are two bedrooms," Daniel said, following her gaze with the awkward awareness of a man suddenly realizing he was alone with a woman who was legally his wife, but remained a complete stranger. "You can have the larger one. I've been sleeping in the smaller room since." Again, he trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the reference to his previous life. Emma nodded, understanding without needing the explanation spelled out. The careful distance he was maintaining, the obvious discomfort with the intimacy that marriage typically implied, all of it spoke to a man who was still grieving deeply for the woman he had actually chosen to love. She felt a mixture of relief and something that might have been disappointment, though she couldn't quite identify which emotion was stronger. "I'll need to return to Mrs. Murphy's to collect my things," she said, setting down the small bundle she had been carrying. It contained everything she owned in the world, beyond the clothes on her back. A spare dress, a worn shawl that had belonged to her mother, and a wooden rosary that Father O'Brien had given her before they left Ireland. "Of course," Daniel agreed. "I'll walk back with you. People will be talking enough without giving them more fuel for their gossip." They made the return journey to town in the same careful silence that had marked their earlier walk. But Emma found herself noticing things she had missed before. The way Daniel automatically moved to walk on the outside when they passed a horse and cart, protecting her from the mud that sprayed up from the wheels. How he touched his hat politely too. The few neighbors they encountered, maintaining his dignity despite the curious stares that followed them. The unconscious competence with which he navigated the world around him. A man comfortable with his place in the community, even if that place had just shifted dramatically. Mrs. Murphy's boarding house occupied a large wooden building near the mill, its rooms packed with Irish families who had arrived with nothing and were slowly working their way towards something that might eventually resemble stability. Catherine Murphy herself was a widow from Galway who had made the crossing 10 years earlier and parlayed her savings and considerable determination into a business that provided both shelter and community for her fellow immigrants. When Daniel and Emma appeared in her front parlor, Mrs. Murphy's reaction was everything Emma had expected and more. The older woman's face cycled through surprise, delight, concern, and finally a kind of fierce, protective approval that made Emma's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Well then," Mrs. Murphy said, enveloping Emma in a hug that smelled of bread dough and lavender water. "I heard what happened at the courthouse, but I wanted to see for myself before I believed it. Daniel Hayes, you've surprised us all today." Daniel shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny, clearly unused to being the center of attention. "Seemed like the right thing to do," he said simply. "The right thing," Mrs. Murphy repeated, her tone suggesting that she found his modest explanation both admirable and insufficient. "Emma dear, you go gather your belongings. Mr. Hayes and I need to have a word." Emma climbed the narrow stairs to the room she had shared with 3 other women, her heart pounding with nervousness about what Mrs. Murphy might be saying to Daniel in her absence. The older woman had been kind to all the Sullivan sisters, but she also possessed a fierce protectiveness toward the young women under her care that had made more than one potential suitor think twice about his intentions. The room was empty, the other occupants either at work or conducting business in town. Emma's few possessions took only minutes to pack, but she found herself lingering by the window that looked out over Millbrook's rooftops toward the mill and the wealthier homes that climbed the hill beyond. Somewhere out there, her sisters were beginning new lives as bound servants, learning to navigate relationships with families who saw them as property rather than people. The thought made her chest ache with a combination of survivor's guilt and desperate hope that they would all find ways to endure until they could be reunited. When she returned to the front parlor, she found Daniel and Mrs. Murphy engaged in what appeared to be a serious but not unfriendly conversation. Both looked up as she descended the stairs, and Emma caught something in Mrs. Murphy's expression that suggested approval mixed with continued concern. "Emma," Mrs. Murphy said, crossing the room to take her hands, "I want you to know that you'll always have a place here if you need it. Marriage is a big step under any circumstances, but when it happens so quickly—" She glanced meaningfully at Daniel. "Well, sometimes people need time to figure out what they've gotten themselves into." "I understand," Emma replied, though she wasn't entirely sure she did. The events of the morning still felt surreal, like something that had happened in a dream from which she might wake at any moment to find herself back on that courthouse platform with Victor Ashford's predatory gaze fixed on her. Daniel stepped forward, his manner formal but not unkind. "Mrs. Murphy is right to be concerned for your welfare. This arrangement is unusual, and I want you to know that I have no expectations beyond providing you with a safe home and the protection of my name. Anything else?" He hesitated, then continued with careful precision. "Anything else will only happen if and when you choose it." The weight of his words settled over the room like snow, quiet and transformative. Emma felt something inside her chest flutter between relief and confusion. Marriage without the expectations typically associated with the state was not something she had imagined possible. Yet here was this man offering exactly that. Freedom within the bonds of matrimony, protection without possession. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more deeply than those simple words could convey. Mrs. Murphy bustled around them, packing a basket with items she insisted Emma would need: a loaf of fresh bread, a jar of preserves, tea, and other provisions that would help establish her new household. "You'll need these to get started," she said, pressing the basket into Emma's hands, along with a worn but serviceable cookbook. "And Emma, you remember what I told you about being a wife? You don't lose yourself just because you've taken someone's name." The advice struck Emma as both practical and profound, the kind of wisdom that could only come from someone who had navigated similar challenges successfully. She thought of her own mother, who had managed to maintain her dignity and sense of self despite the grinding poverty that had eventually claimed her life. Perhaps that was what marriage could be for her. Not the submission she had always feared, but a partnership that allowed her to grow into the woman she was meant to become. The walk back to the cabin felt different than their earlier journeys. The basket Mrs. Murphy had provided gave Emma something concrete to contribute to their shared household, and Daniel's clear statement about his expectations had lifted a weight of anxiety she hadn't fully realized she was carrying. They were still strangers, bound together by circumstance, but now they were strangers with an understanding about what their relationship would and would not include. As they approached the cabin, Emma noticed details she had missed during her first brief visit. A vegetable garden that had been carefully tended earlier in the season, but was now showing signs of neglect. Firewood stacked neatly under cover, but in quantities that suggested Daniel had been planning to spend the winter alone. A chicken coop that stood empty, its occupants presumably eaten or sold when Daniel stopped caring about maintaining such things. "I used to keep chickens," Emma said, gesturing toward the empty coop, "before we left Ireland, and I know something about gardens." Daniel followed her gaze, and she saw something shift in his expression, a flicker of interest that suggested he was beginning to see possibilities he hadn't considered. "The garden did well this past summer," he said, "but I let it go to seed when the harvest came. Didn't seem worth the effort just for myself." There was an opening in his words, an invitation to imagine a different kind of life than the solitary existence he had been maintaining. Emma felt a spark of something that might have been excitement, the first she had experienced since leaving Ireland. The prospect of having useful work to do, of contributing to a household rather than simply serving in one, was more appealing than she had dared to hope. They spent the remainder of the afternoon in careful exploration of domestic arrangements. Daniel showed her how the stove worked, where he kept supplies, how to manage the well and the root cellar. Emma contributed what knowledge she could about cooking and household management, skills her mother had insisted she learn despite their poverty. They worked around each other with the polite wariness of strangers sharing space, but Emma began to sense that beneath Daniel's grief and her own uncertainty, there might be the foundation for something more substantial than mere convenience. Evening came early in October, and with it the need to address practical questions that could no longer be postponed. Daniel had insisted that Emma take the larger bedroom, the one he had obviously shared with his late wife. But she could see the pain the gesture cost him. The room still held traces of feminine presence, a hairbrush on the dresser, sachets of lavender in the wardrobe, curtains made from fabric chosen with care and hung with attention to both function and beauty. "You don't have to give up this room," Emma said, standing in the doorway and taking in the evidence of the life Daniel had lost. "I would be perfectly comfortable in the smaller space." Daniel shook his head firmly. "Sarah would have wanted you to have it. She always said a woman needed a room where she could be herself, apart from anyone else's expectations." His voice caught slightly on his wife's name, but he continued with determined composure. "Besides, I've gotten used to the other room. Change isn't always bad." Emma nodded, understanding that this was about more than sleeping arrangements. Daniel was offering her not just physical space, but the emotional territory to build her own life within their shared household. It was a gift more valuable than anything money could buy, the freedom to become whoever she was meant to be without the weight of someone else's history pressing down on her. That night, as Emma lay in a real bed for the first time in months, she listened to the sounds of the house settling around her and tried to process the extraordinary changes that a single day had brought. This morning she had awakened as the last Sullivan daughter, waiting to be sold into servitude. Tonight she was Emma Hayes, married to a man she barely knew, but who had already shown her more kindness than she had dared to expect from any stranger. Through the thin walls, she could hear Daniel moving around in the other room, the creak of floorboards and the rustle of clothing that spoke to someone having difficulty settling down for sleep. She wondered if he was regretting his impulsive decision, if the reality of sharing his space with another person was proving more difficult than he had anticipated. The thought made her stomach clench with worry, but there was nothing she could do except hope that tomorrow would bring clarity to them both. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the trees with a sound like whispered conversations, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the faint clacking of the mill wheel that never stopped turning. Millbrook continued its daily existence. Around them, full of people who would spend their evening meals discussing the scandalous events at the courthouse and speculating about what might come next for the grieving widower and the Irish girl who had somehow become his wife. But inside the cabin, there was only the sound of two people trying to find their way toward an uncertain future, with nothing to guide them except the hope that sometimes, when the worst seems inevitable, ordinary human decency can still change. Everything. Emma pulled the quilts up to her chin and closed her eyes, allowing herself to believe, for perhaps the first time since leaving Ireland, that tomorrow might actually be better than today. Dawn broke grey and cold over Millbrook, the kind of November morning that warned of winter's approach with every breath of wind that rattled the cabin's windows. Emma woke to the sound of someone moving around in the kitchen, the quiet efficiency of footsteps that belonged to a person accustomed to starting each day before the sun fully cleared the horizon. She lay still for a moment, letting the reality of her new circumstances settle over her like the weight of the quilts that had kept her warm through the night. 3 weeks had passed since that extraordinary morning at the courthouse. 3 weeks of learning to navigate the careful choreography, of two people sharing space without stepping on each other's emotional boundaries. Emma had discovered that Daniel Hayes was a man of rigid routine, someone who found comfort in the predictable rhythm of daily tasks performed with methodical precision. He rose before dawn to tend the fire and prepare coffee, worked in his shop until the light failed, and spent his evenings reading by lamplight or working on small repair projects that seemed to multiply endlessly around the property. Emma had initially tried to insert herself into this routine gradually, offering to help with meals or household tasks, but she quickly learned that Daniel approached such offers with the wariness of someone who had grown accustomed to solitude. Not from any lack of appreciation, she realized, but from the simple fact that he had spent 2 years training himself not to expect or depend on assistance from anyone. Grief had taught him self-sufficiency as a form of self-protection, and unlearning such lessons would take time. Neither of them was entirely sure they wanted to invest. Instead, she had begun creating her own routines that complemented rather than interfered with his established patterns. While Daniel worked in his shop each morning, Emma explored the property and began making mental notes about projects that might benefit from her attention. The abandoned chicken coop represented an obvious opportunity, but she had also noticed that the herb garden behind the kitchen had been choked with weeds, and the root cellar needed organizing before winter. Set in properly. This particular morning found her standing at the kitchen window, watching Daniel emerge from his workshop carrying a wooden bucket that steamed in the cold air. He moved with the purposeful stride of someone engaged in meaningful work, and Emma felt a pang of something that might have been envy. In Ireland, before the blight changed everything, she had been part of a family enterprise where everyone's contribution mattered, where even the smallest tasks felt connected to something larger than themselves. Here she remained an observer of Daniel's life rather than a participant in it. The sound of his boots on the porch steps prompted her to move away from the window and busy herself with preparing breakfast. They had developed an unspoken understanding about meals. Emma would cook if Daniel provided the ingredients, and they would eat together in companionable silence that felt less awkward with each passing day. It was not intimacy exactly, but it was a kind of peaceful coexistence that both of them seemed to find comforting. Daniel entered the kitchen carrying the scent of wood shavings and the particular mixture of oils and stains that marked his trade. He set the bucket near the stove and nodded to Emma with the polite courtesy that had characterized all their interactions. "Good morning," he said, moving to wash his hands at the basin. "Looks like we might get snow before the week's out." Emma glanced toward the window, where the sky was indeed taking on the heavy grey quality that often preceded the season's first snowfall. "The chickens at Mrs. Murphy's were acting restless yesterday when I visited. They always seem to know before people do." This was the closest thing to a real conversation they had managed in several days, and Emma found herself hoping Daniel might continue it. Instead, he simply nodded and took his usual seat at the kitchen table, accepting the plate of eggs and toast she placed before him with a murmured thanks that had become their morning ritual. They ate in the familiar silence, but Emma could sense something different in Daniel's manner this morning, a tension that hadn't been there the previous evening. She had learned to read the subtle signs of his moods, the way he held his shoulders when something was troubling him, the particular quality of stillness that meant he was thinking through a problem, the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was struggling with a decision he didn't want to make. "Is everything well with your work?" she ventured, testing whether he might be willing to share whatever was occupying his thoughts. Daniel looked up from his plate, seeming almost surprised to find her watching him with concern. "The Ashfords have commissioned a dining set," he said after a moment's hesitation. 12 chairs and a table to seat 20. It's the largest project I've been offered since." He paused, then continued with careful precision. "Since before Sarah died." The money would see us through the winter comfortably. Emma waited, sensing there was more to the story than a simple business transaction. Daniel's expression suggested he was wrestling with complications that went beyond the technical challenges of crafting furniture. "But?" she prompted gently. Daniel set down his fork and met her eyes directly for the first time in days. Victor Ashford delivered the commission personally yesterday. He made it clear that his family's patronage comes with certain expectations about how I conduct my personal affairs. The implication hit Emma like a physical blow. Victor Ashford, the man who had tried to buy her for $5 in personal service, was now attempting to use economic pressure to interfere in her marriage. The thought that her presence in Daniel's life might cost him his livelihood made her stomach clench, with guilt and anger in equal measure. "What kind of expectations?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. He suggested that my recent marriage might reflect poorly on my judgment, that respectable families might hesitate to do business with someone who makes impulsive decisions without considering the social consequences. Daniel's voice was carefully neutral, but Emma could hear the underlying tension in every word. He offered to overlook my lapse in judgment if I were to make arrangements for my wife to return to her previous circumstances. The careful euphemism didn't disguise the cruelty of what Victor was proposing. He wanted Emma back on the auction block, available for purchase by the highest bidder, in exchange for allowing Daniel to continue earning a living in Millbrook. It was exactly the kind of calculated manipulation she had learned to expect from men like Victor, who used their wealth and social position as weapons against anyone who dared to challenge their authority. "And what did you tell him?" Emma asked, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded, despite the turmoil churning in her chest. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I told him that my personal affairs were not subject to negotiation, and that if he wished to commission furniture, we would discuss wood and joinery, not my household arrangements." Relief flooded through Emma so powerfully that she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. She had been prepared for the possibility that Daniel might decide their arrangement was more trouble than it was worth, that the practical benefits of protecting her couldn't outweigh the social and economic costs he would face as a result. The fact that he had refused Victor's offer without apparent hesitation spoke to a strength of character that she was only beginning to appreciate. "What will you do about the commission?" she asked. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if the answer might be written in the dark liquid. "I haven't decided," he admitted finally. "The work would take most of the winter to complete, and the payment would allow me to expand the workshop, perhaps take on an apprentice. But accepting it would feel like agreeing to Victor's terms, even if I never explicitly said so." Emma found herself thinking about her sisters, scattered across Pennsylvania and beyond, working in households where they had no choice but to smile and accept whatever treatment their employers chose to provide. The thought of Daniel having to compromise his principles for economic survival felt like a betrayal of everything his gesture at the courthouse had represented. "There must be other families who need furniture," she said. "Other opportunities." "But perhaps," Daniel agreed, but his tone suggested he didn't find the possibility particularly encouraging. Most of the wealthy families in Millbrook take their lead from the Ashfords when it comes to social matters. If Victor spreads word that I'm unreliable or difficult to work with, it could affect my ability to find other commissions. The weight of unintended consequences pressed down on Emma's shoulders like a physical burden. In accepting Daniel's offer of marriage, she had thought only of her own desperate circumstances, not of how her presence in his life might complicate his relationships with the community that provided his livelihood. The possibility that her freedom might come at the cost of his financial security made her question whether she had the right to stay in a situation that was clearly causing him difficulties. "Perhaps Mrs. Murphy was right," she said quietly. "Perhaps I should consider other arrangements until the gossip dies down and people become accustomed to our marriage." Daniel's response was immediate and surprisingly firm. "No," he said, looking directly at her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "You're not going anywhere because Victor Ashford doesn't approve of my choices. If we start making decisions based on what bullies want, we'll never stop running from them." The conviction in his voice surprised Emma almost as much as his immediate rejection of her suggestion. She had expected him to at least consider the practical benefits of temporary separation, to weigh the costs and benefits with the same methodical approach he brought to his carpentry work. Instead, he was displaying a stubborn determination that suggested her welfare had become more important to him than she had realized. "But your business," she protested. "You can't afford to lose customers because of me." "I can't afford to lose my self-respect," Daniel replied. "And that's what would happen if I let Victor Ashford dictate how I live my life. Besides," he added with the ghost of a smile, "you're assuming I need his patronage to survive. I built this business without the Ashfords' help, and I can maintain it the same way." Emma felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't fully realized she was carrying. For the first time since their wedding, Daniel was speaking to her not as a polite stranger sharing his house, but as a partner whose welfare mattered to him, independent of social conventions or economic considerations. It was the first glimpse she had seen of the man who had stepped forward at the courthouse, the person capable of making decisions based on principle rather than prudence. "What can I do to help?" she asked, and meant it more completely than any words she had spoken since arriving in America. Daniel studied her face as if trying to determine whether her offer was genuine or merely polite. "You've already helped. More than you know," he said finally. "Having someone to cook for again, someone who notices when the herb garden needs attention or when the chickens might predict snow. It's made this place feel less like a monument to the past and more like a home where people actually live." The admission caught Emma off guard with its honesty. She had been so focused on her own adjustment to their unusual circumstances that she hadn't considered how her presence might be affecting Daniel's daily experience of grief and solitude. The possibility that she was providing something he needed, even if neither of them had explicitly acknowledged it, changed her understanding of their relationship in ways she was still processing. They finished breakfast in a different kind of silence, one that felt less like careful distance and more like shared contemplation. Emma found herself stealing glances at Daniel's profile as he drank his coffee, noting details she had missed. During their weeks of polite coexistence, the way his hair curled slightly where it touched his collar, the competent strength of his hands wrapped around the ceramic mug, the lines around his eyes that spoke of both sorrow and a capacity for laughter that had been dormant for too long. When Daniel rose to return to his workshop, Emma made a decision that surprised her with its spontaneity. "Would you show me what you're working on?" she asked. "I've never seen a real carpenter's shop, and I'm curious about how furniture comes together." Daniel paused in the doorway, his expression cycling through surprise, uncertainty, and something that might have been pleasure. "It's not very interesting," he said. "Just a lot of measuring and cutting and sanding." "Everything is interesting when you don't know how it works," Emma replied, "and I promise not to get in your way or ask too many questions." The workshop was a revelation. Emma had expected a cluttered space filled with tools and lumber, but what she found instead was a carefully organized domain where every implement had its designated place and every surface served a specific purpose. The air smelled of wood shavings and linseed oil, and the late morning light streaming through the windows illuminated workbenches that showed the wear patterns of years of dedicated use. Daniel moved through the space with obvious comfort, his earlier awkwardness disappearing as he began explaining the various stages of a project currently taking shape on his main workbench. A rocking chair was emerging from pieces of cherry wood, its curved runners and precisely fitted joints demonstrating a level of craftsmanship that made Emma understand why families throughout the region sought out Daniel's work. "The wood tells you what it wants to become," Daniel said, running his hand along the smooth curve of the chair's back. "You can force it into shapes it doesn't want to hold, but it will always fight you. Better to work with the grain. Let the natural strength of the timber guide your decisions." Dad. Emma found herself thinking that the same principle might apply to human relationships, that perhaps the key to making their unusual marriage work lay not in forcing it to conform to conventional expectations, but in allowing it to develop according to its own natural patterns. The thought was too new and fragile to voice, but it lingered in her mind as she watched Daniel work. He had returned to shaping one of the chair's arms, using a plane to remove thin curls of wood with strokes. So, practiced, they seemed effortless. Emma noticed how his entire demeanor changed when he was engaged in his craft, the tension leaving his shoulders and a kind of peaceful concentration settling over his features. This was where Daniel Hayes felt most himself, she realized, surrounded by the tools and materials that allowed him to create something beautiful and useful from raw timber. "Could you teach me?" she asked impulsively. "Not furniture making necessarily, but some of the basic techniques. I'd like to understand how things are made rather than just using them." Daniel looked up from his work, wood shavings caught in his hair, his expression once again cycling through surprise towards something warmer. "It's not easy work," he warned, "and most people don't have the patience for the precision it requires." "I have patience," Emma said, "and I'm stronger than I look. In Ireland, I helped my father with harvest work that required both endurance and attention to detail." Daniel nodded slowly, as if coming to a decision. "We could start with something simple, a box maybe, or a small shelf. Nothing complicated, just basic joinery to see if you enjoy the work." The offer felt like more than instruction in carpentry. Techniques. Daniel was proposing to share something that clearly mattered deeply to him, to trust her with knowledge that represented years of accumulated skill and experience. It was the first truly personal gesture he had made since their marriage, and Emma felt a flutter of something that might have been excitement in her chest. They spent the remainder of the morning with Emma learning to hold and use basic tools. While Daniel worked on his rocking chair, she proved surprisingly adept at understanding the relationship between different implements and their intended functions, and Daniel found himself explaining techniques and principles with increasing enthusiasm as her questions revealed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. By noon, Emma had successfully planned a small board, smooth and square, an accomplishment that felt remarkably satisfying given its apparent simplicity. The physical engagement with wood and tools provided a kind of meditation she hadn't expected, a way of focusing her attention that pushed aside the constant worry about her sisters and her uncertain future in America. "You have good hands for this work," Daniel observed, watching her examine the board she had finished. "Steady, but not afraid to apply pressure when needed. Some people never learn the balance." The praise, modest as it was, warmed Emma more than she would have expected. It had been months since anyone had acknowledged her capability at anything beyond basic domestic tasks, and the suggestion that she might actually be skilled at something new felt like a small miracle. They walked back to the house together for the midday meal, and Emma noticed that the careful distance Daniel usually maintained had diminished somewhat. He walked closer to her, their shoulders occasionally brushing, and when he held the door for her to enter the kitchen, His courtesy felt less formal and more genuinely considerate. As Emma prepared their lunch, she found herself thinking about the morning's conversations and revelations. Daniel's refusal to compromise his principles for economic gain, his invitation to share his workshop, the small signs that their relationship might be evolving beyond mere coexistence towards something that could eventually be called partnership. It was too early to call it progress exactly, but it felt like movement in a positive direction. Outside, the grey sky had darkened further, and the first few snowflakes were beginning to drift past the kitchen window. Winter was coming to Millbrook, and with it the long months when travel would be difficult and social contact limited to the immediate community. Emma found herself thinking that perhaps the isolation might work in their favor, providing time and space for her and Daniel to continue learning about each other without the constant pressure of outside judgment. The afternoon brought their first real test of the morning's tentative progress. Mrs. Catherine Murphy arrived just as they were finishing lunch, her expression suggesting she bore news that couldn't wait for a more convenient time. Emma invited her in for tea, noting how Mrs. Murphy's sharp eyes took in every detail of the domestic scene before her. The comfortable way Emma moved around the kitchen, the relaxed manner in which Daniel accepted her hospitality, the absence of obvious tension between them. "I've come with news from town," Mrs. Murphy said, without preamble once they were all seated around the kitchen table. "And I'm afraid some of it concerns the both of you directly." Emma felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. News from town rarely brought anything positive for the Irish families trying to establish themselves in Millbrook, and the serious expression on Mrs. Murphy's face suggested this would be no exception. "Victor Ashford has been making the rounds," Mrs. Murphy continued, "talking to anyone who will listen about the irregularity of your marriage and what he calls the dangerous precedent it sets for proper social order. He's suggesting that allowing such arrangements to stand without consequence might encourage other undesirable elements to challenge established customs." Daniel's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm when he spoke. "Let him talk. People can make their own judgments about what's proper and what isn't." "That's just it," Mrs. Murphy said. "He's not content to let people make their own judgments. He's actively working to turn opinion against you, suggesting that Daniel's grief made him vulnerable to manipulation by a scheming Irish girl who saw an opportunity to escape her proper place." The characterization stung Emma more than she wanted to admit, reducing her desperate acceptance of Daniel's offer to calculated opportunism. The fact that some people in Millbrook might view her marriage in such terms made her wonder if she would ever be able to establish herself as anything more than an object of suspicion and resentment. "There's more," Mrs. Murphy continued reluctantly. "He's been approaching the other families who employ your sisters, suggesting that they might want to reconsider the terms of their contracts. Apparently, he's concerned that the Sullivan women might prove as troublesome as their sister if given too much freedom." The words hit Emma like a physical blow. Her sisters, scattered across the region and vulnerable to whatever treatment their employers chose to provide, were now facing additional scrutiny and potential hardship because of her marriage to Daniel. The possibility that her escape from servitude might make life more difficult for Mary, Bridget, Margaret, Catherine, Anne, and little Nora made her feel sick with guilt and helpless rage. Daniel reached across the table and covered her hand with his own, the first deliberately comforting gesture he had made since their wedding. "We'll figure this out," he said quietly. "Victor Ashford doesn't get to dictate what happens to your family any more than he gets to dictate what happens to ours." The word ours hung in the air between them, unexpected and profound in its implications. For the first time, Daniel had spoken of them as a unit facing challenges together, rather than as two separate individuals sharing space out of convenience. Emma felt tears prick at her eyes, though whether from gratitude, relief, or continued worry about her sisters, she couldn't say. Mrs. Murphy watched this exchange with obvious approval. "That's the spirit I was hoping to see," she said. "But you should know that this is likely just the beginning. Victor Ashford doesn't give up easily when he sets his mind to something, and he clearly sees Emma's marriage as a personal affront. That needs to be corrected." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of hoofbeats in the yard announced the arrival of another visitor. Emma moved to the window and felt her blood turn cold at the sight of Victor Ashford himself dismounting. From a fine black horse, his expensive clothes and confident bearing marking him as someone accustomed to having his wishes treated as commands. "Speak of the devil," Mrs. Murphy muttered, rising from her chair. "I should go. My presence here might complicate whatever he's planning to say." But Daniel shook his head firmly. "Stay," he said. "Whatever Victor Ashford has to say to me, he can say in front of witnesses." The knock on the door came sharp and imperious, the kind of summons that expected immediate response. Daniel rose unhurriedly and walked to answer it, his movements deliberate and unhurried, in a way that suggested he would not be intimidated by unexpected visits from self-important young men. Emma remained seated at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling, as Daniel opened the door to face whatever new challenge Victor Ashford had brought to their doorstep. Victor Ashford filled the doorway like a storm cloud, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere. Inside the modest cabin, he was impeccably dressed despite the November cold, his wool coat tailored to perfection and his leather boots polished to a mirror shine that reflected his absolute confidence in his own authority. Everything about him spoke of wealth and privilege, from the gold watch chain visible across his vest to the way he stood as if the entire world existed for his convenience. "Hayes," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the casual arrogance of someone who had never been denied anything he truly wanted. "I believe we need to finish our conversation from yesterday. I trust you've had time to reconsider my generous offer." Daniel remained in the doorway, making no move to invite Victor inside. His carpenter's frame filled the space with quiet determination, and Emma noticed how his posture had shifted into something that resembled a guard stance, protective and unmovable. "I told you yesterday that my personal affairs are not open for negotiation," Daniel replied evenly. "Nothing has changed since then." Victor's smile was cold and calculating, the expression of a man who had come prepared for resistance and found it almost amusing. "Everything has changed, actually. I've spent the morning speaking with several prominent families about their furniture needs for the coming year. Interesting how quickly word spreads about a craftsman's reliability when questions arise about his judgment." The threat was delivered with such casual cruelty that Emma felt her hands clench involuntarily under the kitchen table. Victor was systematically destroying Daniel's reputation and livelihood, using his family's social position as a weapon to force compliance with his wishes. It was exactly the kind of calculated manipulation she had learned to expect from men who wielded power without accountability. "You're welcome to spread whatever stories you like," Daniel said, his voice maintaining its steady calm despite the anger Emma could see building in his shoulders. "But my wife stays where she belongs, which is here with me." The word wife seemed to strike Victor like a physical blow, his composed facade cracking slightly to reveal the fury beneath. Emma realized that this confrontation was about more than just economic pressure or social conventions. Victor had been personally humiliated by her rejection at the courthouse, his sense of entitlement challenged by a mere carpenter who had dared to interfere with his plans. "Your wife," Victor repeated, loading the words with contempt, "a convenient legal fiction that fools no one with sense. Everyone knows this arrangement is temporary, a charitable gesture that will end as soon as you come to your senses about..." The costs involved. Mrs. Murphy rose from her chair at the kitchen table, her Irish temper finally overriding her usual diplomatic caution. Victor Ashford, you have no business dictating how decent people conduct their lives. Daniel Hayes has more honor in his little finger than your entire family has managed to accumulate in 3 generations. Victor's attention shifted to Mrs. Murphy with predatory interest, clearly pleased to have additional targets for his venom. Ah, Mrs. Murphy, how fitting that you're here to witness this conversation. Perhaps you can explain to your fellow Irish how quickly charity turns to burden when the novelty wears off. Emma felt something inside her chest catch fire at the casual dismissal in his tone, the assumption that she was nothing more than a problem to be solved or discarded at convenience. She rose from her chair and walked to the doorway, positioning herself beside Daniel with deliberate dignity. "I think you should leave," she said, her voice carrying clearly, despite the way her heart was hammering against her ribs. Victor's gaze fixed on her with the intensity of a predator studying prey, and Emma forced herself not to step back from the malice she saw in his eyes. "Still playing at being the lady of the manor, I see. Tell me, Emma, how long do you think this fantasy will last when Hayes realizes what supporting a wife actually costs? When his business fails because respectable people won't associate with someone who makes such questionable decisions?" "Long enough," Daniel said firmly, moving slightly forward so that his shoulder was aligned with Emma's, a gesture of solidarity that felt more intimate than any words could have expressed. "And my business will survive just fine without the patronage of bullies and cowards." The insult hit its mark, and Victor's carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely. His face flushed red with rage, and his hand moved instinctively toward the riding crop he carried, a gesture that revealed more about his character than any amount of polite conversation could have managed. "You're making a serious mistake, Hayes," he snarled. "My family has influence throughout this county, and we have long memories for those who cross us. Your little Irish pet will bring you nothing but trouble, and when that trouble comes, don't expect anyone to step forward and help you the way you helped her." The crude characterization of Emma as a pet rather than a person pushed Daniel past the limits of his patience. Emma saw his hands clench into fists, and for a moment she thought he might actually strike Victor despite the social and legal consequences such an action would bring. Instead, he stepped fully outside onto the porch, forcing Victor to back down the steps or risk a physical confrontation he was clearly unprepared to handle. "Get off my property," Daniel said, his voice deadly quiet. "And don't come back. If you have business concerns to discuss, send them through proper legal channels. If you want to spread gossip and make threats, find someone else to listen to your poison." Victor retreated to his horse, but his expression suggested this confrontation was far from over. "You'll regret this decision, Hayes. Both of you will regret it. And when you do, remember that I offered you a way out of the mess you've created." He mounted his horse with theatrical flair and spurred it into a gallop that sent mud flying. From the yard, a parting gesture of contempt that left the 3 people on the porch staring after him in tense silence. Emma realized she was trembling, though whether from anger, fear, or the after-effects of adrenaline, she couldn't determine. Mrs. Murphy was the first to break the silence. "Well," she said with grim satisfaction, "at least now we know exactly where we stand. Victor Ashford has declared war, which means the rest of us had better prepare to fight back." Daniel turned to Emma, his expression serious but not unkind. "I'm sorry you had to hear that, and I'm sorry my decision to help you has put you in the middle of something this ugly." Emma shook her head firmly. "You're not responsible for Victor Ashford's cruelty, and I'm not some helpless burden that needs to be protected from unpleasant realities. We're in this together now, and I intend to do my part to see it through." The declaration surprised her with its vehemence, but as soon as the words left her mouth, Emma realized she meant them completely. Somewhere during the past weeks of shared meals and quiet conversations, of learning to use woodworking tools and watching Daniel create beautiful things from raw timber, she had stopped thinking of their marriage as a temporary arrangement for mutual convenience. It had become something worth defending, worth fighting for, worth the risks that came with standing up to men like Victor Ashford. Mrs. Murphy nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit we'll need. But you should both understand that Victor won't give up easily. He'll look for other ways to pressure you, other vulnerabilities to exploit. Your sisters, Emma, are still at risk as long as he feels you've humiliated him." The reminder of her sister's precarious situations sent a chill through Emma that had nothing to do with the November weather. Mary, Bridget, Margaret, Catherine, Anne, and little Nora were scattered across Pennsylvania, bound by contracts that left them vulnerable to whatever treatment their employers chose to provide. If Victor succeeded in poisoning opinion against the Sullivan family, her sisters could find themselves facing increased hardship, or even having their contracts sold to less scrupulous masters. "What can we do to protect them?" Emma asked, hating the note of desperation that crept into her voice, despite her attempts to maintain composure. Mrs. Murphy and Daniel exchanged a look that suggested they had been thinking about the same problem. "There might be options," Mrs. Murphy said carefully. "Legal options, if we can find the right approach. Pennsylvania law does provide some protections for indentured servants, and there are people in Philadelphia who work to ensure those protections are enforced." Daniel nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that too. My cousin James works for a law firm in the city, handles contracts and labor disputes. He might be able to review your sisters' situations, make sure their employers are adhering to the legal requirements." The possibility of actual help, of concrete action they could take to protect her family, made Emma feel dizzy with relief and hope. She had been carrying the weight of helplessness for so long that the prospect of being able to do something, anything, to improve her sister's circumstances felt almost too good to believe. "That would cost money," she said practically. "Lawyers don't work for free, especially when their clients are Irish immigrants with no social standing." "I have money," Daniel said simply, "and a family that needs protecting is as good a reason as any to spend it." The casual way he included her sisters in his definition of family made Emma's throat tighten with emotion. Here was a man who had married her out of simple human decency, asked for nothing in return except peaceful coexistence, and was now offering to spend his hard-earned savings to help people he had never met, simply because they mattered to her. "I can contribute too," Mrs. Murphy added. "The boarding house provides a modest income, and the Irish families who stay with me would be willing to help if it means protecting some of our own. We've learned that we have to look out for each other, because no one else will." The conversation continued through the afternoon as they planned their response to Victor's threats and considered options for protecting Emma's sisters. Mrs. Murphy proved to have an extensive network of contacts throughout the Irish community, people who might be able to provide information about employment conditions or legal resources. Daniel's knowledge of business practices and his connections to established American families offered different but complementary advantages. As the day wore on, Emma found herself marveling at how naturally the three of them worked together, how easily they shared ideas and built on each other's suggestions. It felt like the kind of partnership she had always imagined but never experienced, where each person's strengths compensated for the other's limitations and everyone's contribution was valued equally. Evening brought snow in earnest, fat flakes that swirled past the windows and began accumulating on the ground with the promise of winter's first real storm. Mrs. Murphy accepted their invitation to stay for dinner rather than risk the increasingly treacherous journey back to town, and the evening meal became an impromptu strategy session disguised as social conversation. The key Mrs. Murphy said over Emma's hearty stew, is to make sure Victor understands that attacking you means attacking all of us. Bullies like him count on isolating their targets, making them feel like they're facing the world alone. If we stand together, show that the Irish community and decent Americans like Daniel are united, he might think twice about continuing his campaign. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. There's also the matter of his family's business interests. The Ashfords depend on good relationships with their workers and the broader community. If word spreads that Victor is using his position to persecute families who've done nothing wrong, it could affect their reputation in ways that matter to them financially. Emma listened to their discussion with growing appreciation for the complex social dynamics at play in Millbrook. She had been thinking of their conflict with Victor in personal terms, a matter of one man's wounded pride and desire for revenge. But Mrs. Murphy and Daniel understood that it was really about power structures and community relationships, about whether people like Victor could use their wealth and status to override basic human decency with impunity. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door, sharp and urgent in a way that made all three of them freeze momentarily. Daniel rose to answer it, but Emma noticed that he picked up a poker from beside the fireplace as he moved toward the door, clearly not taking any chances about who might be visiting in a snowstorm after the day's confrontation. The visitor proved to be Father Michael O'Brien, the Irish priest who served Millbrook's Catholic families. He stood on the porch covered in snow, his black coat dusted white, and his usually cheerful face drawn with worry. Daniel immediately invited him inside, helping him out of his wet outer garments and settling him near the fire with hot coffee. "I apologize for the late hour," Father O'Brien said once he had recovered enough to speak clearly, "but I felt you needed to know what's happening in town immediately." Victor Ashford spent the evening at Sullivan's Tavern, buying drinks for anyone who would listen to his complaints about Irish immigrants taking advantage of American charity. Emma felt her stomach drop as she realized the implications. Sullivan's Tavern was where Millbrook's working men gathered after their shifts at the mill, a place where resentments about job competition and social change could easily be inflamed by someone with Victor's resources and lack of scruples. "How bad was it?" Mrs. Murphy asked, her expression grim. Father O'Brien shook his head sadly. "Bad enough. He's telling anyone who will listen that Emma tricked Daniel into marriage, that she's probably carrying another man's child and looking for someone to support her bastard, that the Irish families are planning to use similar tactics to infiltrate respectable American society." The lies were so vicious and calculated that Emma felt physically sick hearing them repeated, even by someone who clearly didn't believe them. Victor was systematically destroying her reputation and, by extension, Daniel's, using the kind of crude sexual innuendo that would be impossible to refute directly without seeming to acknowledge its validity. "There's more," Father O'Brien continued reluctantly. "He's organized a meeting for tomorrow night, supposedly to discuss the welfare of the community's moral standards. He's invited all the prominent families and many of the mill workers. Anyone he thinks might be sympathetic to his arguments about the dangers of allowing improper relationships to continue unchallenged." Daniel set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. A public meeting means he's confident he has enough support to force some kind of action. The question is what kind of action he's planning to propose. "Nothing good," Mrs. Murphy said grimly. "Men like Victor don't organize public meetings unless they're sure they can control the outcome. He's planning something that will put pressure on both of you to end your marriage, probably something that will seem reasonable to people who don't understand the real circumstances." Emma found herself thinking about her sisters again, wondering if Victor's campaign would reach them in their scattered locations across Pennsylvania. The thought of Mary or little Nora hearing these lies about her character Believing that their sister had become the kind of woman Victor was describing made her feel sick with shame and helpless rage. "We need to be there," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "At the meeting tomorrow night. If Victor is going to spread lies about me, the least I can do is face them directly." Daniel turned to look at her with an expression that mixed admiration with concern. "Emma, that could be dangerous. Public meetings like this can turn ugly quickly, especially when they're organized by someone with a personal grudge." "All the more reason for me to be there," Emma replied. "If I hide away like I'm ashamed of something, it just confirms whatever Victor is telling people. But if I stand up and speak for myself, at least some people might listen to the truth instead of his version of events." Mrs. Murphy nodded slowly. "The girl has a point, and if Emma's going to face this, she shouldn't do it alone. The Irish families will stand with her, and I suspect there are more decent Americans in Millbrook than Victor realizes." Father O'Brien cleared his throat diplomatically. "I should mention that I've already spoken with Judge Porter about the legal aspects of this situation. He wanted you to know that whatever Victor might claim about the validity of your marriage, Pennsylvania law is quite clear. Your union is legal and binding, and no community meeting or social pressure can change that fact." The information provided some comfort, but Emma knew that legal validity and social acceptance were two different things entirely. They could remain married in the eyes of the law while being ostracized by the community, making Daniel's business impossible to maintain and their daily lives increasingly difficult. As the evening progressed and the snow continued falling outside, their small group refined their plans for the following night's meeting. Father O'Brien would rally the Irish families and any sympathetic Americans he could identify. Mrs. Murphy would use her network of contacts to spread the true story of Emma and Daniel's marriage, countering Victor's lies with facts. Daniel would speak as a respected member of the community, vouching for Emma's character and defending their right to make their own decisions about their relationship. But it was Emma herself who would face the greatest challenge. She would need to stand before a room full of strangers, many of whom would already be predisposed to believe the worst about her, and convince them that she was worthy of the respect and basic human dignity that Victor was trying to deny her. The prospect terrified her, but it also awakened something fierce and determined in her chest. She had survived the ocean crossing that killed her mother, watched her sisters sold into servitude one by one, and faced the possibility of being purchased by Victor Ashford for purposes that didn't bear thinking about. Standing up in a public meeting and speaking her truth felt frightening, but it was also the first real chance she had been given to fight back against the forces that had been controlling her life since the potato blight destroyed everything her family had built in Ireland. When Father O'Brien finally departed and Mrs. Murphy settled down for the night in the small guest room, Emma and Daniel found themselves alone together for the first time since Victor's afternoon visit. They sat by the fire in companionable silence, each lost in thought about the challenges ahead, until Daniel spoke quietly into the peaceful hush. "You don't have to do this," he said. "Face that meeting tomorrow night. We could leave Millbrook, start over somewhere else where Victor's influence doesn't reach." Emma considered the offer seriously, imagining how much simpler their lives would be if they could simply walk away from the conflict. But running would mean abandoning her sisters to whatever treatment Victor might arrange for them. And it would also mean giving up on the life she and Daniel had begun building together, however tentatively. "No," she said finally. "This is where we belong now. This is our home, and I won't let Victor Ashford drive us away from it just because he can't accept that his money doesn't entitle him to own people." Daniel nodded slowly, and Emma thought she saw something like pride in his expression. "Then we'll face it together," he said. "Whatever happens tomorrow night, we'll face it together." The next evening arrived grey and cold, with the kind of bitter wind that cut through even the heaviest coats and made every step toward town feel like a battle against the elements themselves. Emma had spent the day in careful preparation, choosing her best dress and arranging her hair with the kind of attention to detail that her mother had always insisted conveyed respect for both oneself and others. Daniel walked beside her with quiet determination, his own appearance meticulously neat despite the weather. Mrs. Murphy and Father O'Brien had gone ahead to rally their supporters, leaving Emma and Daniel to make the journey alone with nothing but their shared resolve to sustain them. The meeting was being held in Millbrook's largest public space, the assembly hall adjacent to the courthouse, where Emma had first encountered Daniel less than 2 months earlier. As they approached the building, they could see light spilling from the windows and hear the low murmur of conversation that suggested a substantial crowd had gathered. "Ready?" Daniel asked as they reached the steps leading to the main entrance. Emma took a deep breath of the cold night air, straightened her shoulders and nodded. "Ready?" she said, and meant it. Inside, the hall was packed with nearly every adult resident of Millbrook, their faces reflecting the full spectrum of opinion from obvious hostility to cautious sympathy. Victor Ashford stood at the front of the room beside a makeshift podium, his expression confident and satisfied as he surveyed the crowd he had assembled. But as Emma and Daniel made their way to seats near the back of the hall, she noticed other faces in the crowd that gave her hope. Mrs. Murphy sat with a group of Irish families, their presence representing solidarity that couldn't be purchased or intimidated. Judge Porter was there, his expression carefully neutral, but his mere attendance suggesting that legal propriety would be observed. Even some of the American families looked uncertain about Victor's campaign, their expressions suggesting they were still making up their minds about the righteousness of his cause. Victor called the meeting to order with the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to without question. His opening remarks were carefully crafted to sound reasonable and concerned rather than vindictive, focusing on the importance of maintaining community standards and protecting vulnerable young women from making decisions they might later regret. But as he warmed to his theme, his true motivations began to show through the veneer of public-spirited concern. He spoke about the dangers of allowing improper relationships to continue unchallenged, about the precedent that might be set if immigrants were allowed to circumvent established social customs, about the need to protect the moral fabric of their community from forces that sought to undermine it. When he finished his presentation and opened the floor for discussion, the first few speakers echoed his concerns with varying degrees of enthusiasm. But then, Mrs. Murphy rose from her seat, her voice carrying clearly through the hall as she defended Emma's character and challenged Victor's version of events. "I've known Emma Sullivan since she arrived in Millbrook," she said firmly. "I've watched her conduct herself with dignity and grace despite circumstances that would have broken a lesser person. Her marriage to Daniel Hayes is a union between two decent people who deserve our respect, not our condemnation." Other voices followed, some supporting Victor's position, but others defending Emma and Daniel's right to make their own choices about their relationship. The debate grew heated as long-suppressed tensions about class, ethnicity, and social change bubbled to the surface of Millbrook's carefully maintained civility. Finally, Judge Porter rose and called for order. "This is a legal matter as much as a social one," he said with quiet authority. "The marriage between Daniel Hayes and Emma Sullivan is valid under Pennsylvania law, recognized by this court, and not subject to community approval or disapproval. What we're really discussing here is whether we're the kind of community that respects individual liberty or one that allows mob rule to override legal rights." The judge's intervention shifted the tenor of the discussion, but Victor was not prepared to concede defeat so easily. Legal technicalities are one thing, he said, but we all know what really happened here. A desperate immigrant girl manipulated a grieving widower into a marriage that serves only her interests. The question is whether we're going to allow such deception to stand unchallenged. Emma felt something snap inside her chest at the casual dismissal of her humanity inherent in Victor's words. She rose from her seat before she fully realized she was moving, her voice carrying clearly through the hall as every face turned toward her. "I am not a desperate immigrant girl," she said, her words ringing with quiet dignity. "I am Emma Hayes, and I am here to speak for myself, since Mr. Ashford seems incapable of acknowledging that I have a voice of my own." The hall fell silent as Emma made her way to the front of the room, her chin high and her back straight, despite the way her hands were trembling. This was her moment, her chance to speak her truth before the entire community that would determine whether she and Daniel could build a life together in Millbrook. "Mr. Ashford is correct that I was in desperate circumstances when Daniel offered me marriage," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "My family had lost everything to the potato blight in Ireland. My mother died during the ocean crossing. My sisters were sold into indentured servitude one by one until I was the last remaining on that courthouse platform." She paused, letting the reality of those circumstances settle over the crowd before continuing. "But what Mr. Ashford refuses to acknowledge is that I had a choice that morning. I could have accepted his offer of $5 for what he called personal service, or I could have accepted Daniel's offer of marriage and citizenship. I chose marriage because I chose dignity over degradation, partnership over possession." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Emma saw several people in the crowd shift uncomfortably as they were forced to confront the reality of what Victor had actually proposed at the auction. His offer had been public knowledge, but hearing it described so plainly made its true nature impossible to ignore or rationalize. Daniel Hayes stepped forward that morning not because he was manipulated or deceived, but because he saw a fellow human being in desperate need and chose to help when no one else would, Emma continued. "He asked for nothing in return except the opportunity to provide me with a safe home and legal protection. He has treated me with kindness and respect, given me the freedom to make my own choices about my future, and accepted me as a partner rather than demanding submission as a servant." She turned to look directly at Victor, her eyes steady and unwavering. "Mr. Ashford cannot forgive the fact that I chose Daniel's offer over his, that I preferred marriage to a carpenter over whatever arrangements he had in mind for me. His campaign against our union has nothing to do with community standards or moral concerns. It's about a wealthy man's wounded pride that a poor Irish girl dared to reject him." The accusation sent a ripple of shocked murmurs through the crowd. But Emma wasn't finished. "He has threatened my husband's livelihood, spread lies about my character, and put my sisters at risk of increased hardship because he cannot accept that his money doesn't entitle him to own people. If this community chooses to support such behavior, then it's not the kind of community where decent people can hope to build decent lives." Emma returned to her seat in silence that felt like the held breath before a thunderclap. She had said everything she needed to say, laid out the truth as clearly and directly as she could manage. Now it was up to the people of Millbrook to decide what kind of community they wanted to be. Judge Porter rose again, his expression thoughtful and grave. "I think we've heard enough testimony to understand the real issues at stake here," he said. "This is not about legal technicalities or community standards. It's about whether we believe in individual liberty and human dignity, or whether we're going to allow wealth and social position to override basic decency." The discussion that followed was more subdued than the earlier exchanges, as if Emma's direct challenge to Victor had forced everyone present to examine their own motivations and prejudices more honestly. Several speakers rose to defend Emma and Daniel's marriage, including some who had initially seemed sympathetic to Victor's arguments. When the meeting finally ended near midnight, no formal resolutions had been passed or votes taken. But the atmosphere in the hall had shifted fundamentally from when the evening began. Victor's confident coalition had fractured as people reconsidered their positions, and Emma could see in many faces a new respect for her courage in speaking so directly about her circumstances. As the crowd dispersed into the cold night, Daniel took Emma's arm with gentle protectiveness. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," he said quietly. "You didn't just defend our marriage tonight. You defended the principle that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their circumstances." Emma leaned against his solid warmth as they walked home through the snow, feeling drained but also strangely liberated. She had faced down Victor Ashford and the assembled judgment of Millbrook's citizens, spoken her truth without apology or compromise, and emerged with her integrity intact. The weeks that followed brought gradual but unmistakable changes to their lives in Millbrook. Daniel's business, rather than suffering from social ostracism, actually improved as families who had been uncertain about his reliability decided that his willingness to stand up for his principles made him more trustworthy rather than less. Emma found herself accepted, if not universally welcomed, by many of the town's residents who had been moved by her dignity and directness at the public meeting. Most importantly, news arrived from Philadelphia that Daniel's cousin James had successfully reviewed the contracts binding Emma's sisters and found grounds to challenge several of them on legal technicalities. Mary and Bridget were freed from particularly harsh arrangements and relocated to more humane employers, while the threat of legal scrutiny convinced the other families to treat their remaining Sullivan servants with greater care and respect. Victor Ashford, faced with the collapse of his social coalition and the prospect of legal challenges to his own business practices, gradually retreated from his campaign against Emma and Daniel. His wounded pride would never fully heal, but he had learned that there were limits to what his wealth and position could accomplish when confronted by people willing to stand up for what was right. Spring came early to Millbrook that year, bringing with it new possibilities and renewed hope. Emma's vegetable garden flourished under her careful attention, and the chicken coop once again housed a flock of productive hens. Daniel's workshop buzzed with activity as orders poured in from customers who valued both his craftsmanship and his character. But the most significant change was in the relationship between Emma and Daniel themselves. The external pressures they had faced together had forged their convenient arrangement into something deeper and more meaningful. They had chosen each other not once, but repeatedly, through crisis and conflict, through doubt and determination. On a warm evening in May, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Emma reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment of peace and contentment. A year ago, she had been a desperate refugee facing an uncertain future on the auction block. Now she was Emma Hayes, wife to a good man, mistress of her own household, and a respected member of a community that had learned to value character over circumstances. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Daniel as they watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "Stepping forward that morning at the courthouse?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer with the same careful precision he brought to his carpentry work. "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally. "I regret that you and your sisters were put in circumstances where such desperate measures seemed like the only option. But I don't regret marrying you, Emma. Not for a single moment." Emma reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers with the natural ease that had developed between them over months of shared challenges and small victories. "Nor I," she said simply. "Whatever brought us together, I'm grateful for it." As summer deepened and their first anniversary approached, Emma often found herself thinking about the courthouse steps where their story had begun. She would remember the fear and uncertainty of that October morning, the desperate hope that someone somewhere might step forward and change everything. Daniel Hayes had been that someone, a man who understood that sometimes the most radical act is simply treating another human being with basic dignity and respect. Their marriage had begun as a business transaction designed to save her from a fate worse than servitude, but it had grown into something neither of them had expected, a true partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and the hard-won knowledge that love often grows strongest in the soil of adversity. The last daughter sold at auction had found her home at last, not in the house Daniel had built with his own hands, but in the life they had created together through courage, determination, and an unwavering commitment to treating each other as equals worthy of dignity and choice. In a world that seemed determined to reduce people to their worst circumstances, they had proven that ordinary human decency could still triumph over wealth, power, and prejudice. Sometimes the most extraordinary transformations begin with the simplest acts of kindness, performed by people who refuse to look away when others are suffering. Daniel Hayes had stepped forward when no one else would, offering not just marriage, but freedom, not just protection, but partnership, not just a name, but a future filled with possibilities neither of them had dared to imagine alone. In the end, it wasn't about what shocked the town that mattered most. It was about what happened after, when the headlines faded and the gossip moved on to other scandals. It was about two people who chose each other every day, who built something beautiful and lasting from the broken pieces of their separate pasts, who proved that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with passion, but with the simple decision to stand up and do what's right, regardless of the cost. 5 years had passed since that snowy night when Emma Hayes stood before the assembled citizens of Millbrook and spoke her truth with a courage that transformed not just her own life, but the entire community's understanding of what it meant to treat people with dignity. The woman who now stood in the doorway of Hayes' carpentry workshop bore little resemblance to the frightened girl who had once waited on a courthouse platform to be sold into servitude. Emma's hair, now touched with premature silver threads that caught the morning light like spun metal, was pinned back in a practical style that spoke of someone who worked with her hands and took pride in useful labor. Her dress, made from fine wool but cut for movement rather than display, marked her as a woman of substance who had earned her place in the world through determination rather than birthright. Most remarkably, her eyes held the steady confidence of someone who had faced the worst that life could offer and emerged not just intact but stronger. The workshop itself had expanded dramatically from the modest space Daniel had maintained during his years of solitary grief. 2 additional buildings now housed specialized equipment and provided workspace for the 3 apprentices who had come to learn carpentry from a master whose reputation extended far beyond Millbrook's borders. The Hayes name had become synonymous with furniture of such exceptional quality that wealthy families from Philadelphia and New York regularly commissioned pieces that would become family heirlooms for generations. But this morning brought challenges that had nothing to do with woodworking or business success. Emma stood reading a letter that had arrived on the previous evening's mail coach, its contents threatening to unravel everything she and Daniel had built together over the past 5 years. The paper trembled slightly in her hands, not from fear exactly, but from the barely contained fury that such injustice could still reach into their carefully constructed sanctuary. The letter bore the official seal of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, But its contents had been dictated by forces far more personal and vindictive than bureaucratic procedure. After 5 years of simmering resentment, Victor Ashford had found a new weapon to use against the woman who had dared to reject his authority. And this time, he was striking at the very foundation of everything Emma held dear. According to the legal document, questions had been raised about the validity of Emma's marriage to Daniel Hayes. An anonymous complainant had provided evidence suggesting that Emma Sullivan had already been married in Ireland before the potato famine, making her subsequent union to Daniel Hayes bigamous under Pennsylvania law. If the allegations proved true, their marriage would be declared invalid. Emma would lose her legal status as an American citizen, and she could face deportation back to Ireland, regardless of the life she had built in Millbrook. The accusations were lies, of course, crafted with just enough plausible detail to require extensive investigation and legal proceedings. Emma had never been married in Ireland, had never even been formally courted by any of the young men in her village before. Starvation and desperation drove her family to America, but proving her innocence would require documentation from a country that had largely collapsed into chaos, testimony from witnesses who had died during the crossing or scattered across 2 continents, and legal resources that could bankrupt even a successful carpenter's household. Daniel entered the workshop, carrying 2 cups of coffee, his morning ritual unchanged despite the years of prosperity that had transformed almost every other aspect of their lives. At 51, he moved with the deliberate precision of a master craftsman, his hair now completely silver, but his hands as steady and capable as ever. The lines around his eyes spoke of laughter shared and challenges overcome, but this morning, his expression grew grave as he noticed the tension in Emma's posture. "Bad news?" he asked, setting down the cups and moving to read over her shoulder with the easy intimacy that had developed between them through years of genuine partnership. Emma handed him the letter without speaking, watching his face as he absorbed the implications of Victor's latest attack. She saw his jaw tighten with controlled anger, the same quiet fury that had sustained him through their earlier battles with social prejudice and economic pressure. But there was something else in his expression now, a weariness that suggested he was growing tired of having to defend their right to exist in peace. "He never gives up, does he?" Daniel said finally, setting the letter aside with deliberate care. 5 years of success, 5 years of proving ourselves to this community, and Victor Ashford still can't accept that you chose me over him. Emma moved to stand beside him, their shoulders touching in the unconscious gesture of solidarity that had become second nature over the years. "It's not really about you and me anymore," she said quietly. "It's about power, about whether people like Victor get to determine how other people live their lives. We've become a symbol of something he can't tolerate." The truth of her words hung between them like smoke from the workshop's forge. Their marriage had indeed become more than a personal relationship. It represented the possibility that social barriers could be overcome, that love and respect could triumph over wealth and privilege, that ordinary people could choose their own destinies regardless of the circumstances of their birth. For families throughout the region struggling with similar challenges, Emma and Daniel Hayes had become proof that such transformations were possible. But symbols, as they had learned over the years, attracted attention from those who preferred the old certainties of rigid social hierarchy. Victor Ashford was not alone in his resentment of their success. He had allies among the wealthy families who saw the Hayes marriage as a dangerous precedent that might encourage other inappropriate unions between established Americans and immigrant newcomers. The workshop door opened to admit their eldest, apprentice Thomas McCarthy, a young Irish man whose family had arrived in Millbrook 3 years earlier as part of the continuing wave of refugees from the economic devastation that followed the potato famine. Thomas had proven exceptionally gifted at furniture making, and Daniel had been grooming him to eventually take over portions of the business as demand continued to grow. "Morning, Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," Thomas said with the respectful familiarity that marked all their relationships with the young men they trained. "I've got the Morrison dining chairs ready for final inspection, and the Williams family is expected this afternoon to review the cabinet designs." Emma noticed how Thomas's expression changed as he took in the tension that filled the workshop, despite the early hour. Like all the Irish families in Millbrook, the McCarthys understood that their security depended partly on the continued success and acceptance of families like the Hayeses, who had managed to establish themselves in the community. Any threat to Emma and Daniel's position would have implications for everyone who shared their heritage. "Thomas," Daniel said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions, "I need you to send word to the other apprentices that will be closing the workshop for the rest of the week. Family emergency." The young man's eyes flicked to the letter in Emma's hands, and his expression grew serious. "Anything we can do to help, Mr. Hayes? The Irish families, we stick together when trouble comes calling." Emma felt a familiar warmth at the offer of support, the same sense of community solidarity that had sustained them through their earlier trials. But this challenge was different from the social pressure and economic threats they had faced before. This was a legal attack that struck at the very foundation of their marriage, and it would require resources and expertise that went far beyond what their friends and neighbors could provide. "Thank you, Thomas," she said gently, "but this is something Daniel and I need to handle ourselves. Just keep the business running smoothly while we're away. We'll be back as soon as we can." After Thomas departed to spread word of the temporary closure, Emma and Daniel spent the morning making practical arrangements for an extended absence from Millbrook. The legal battle ahead would require them to travel to Philadelphia, where Daniel's cousin James now practiced law with one of the city's most prestigious firms. If anyone could navigate the complex legal challenges Victor had created, it would be James Hayes, whose expertise in immigration and citizenship law had already helped secure freedom for several of Emma's sisters. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the person of Judge William Porter, whose support during their earlier confrontations with Victor had proven invaluable. Now nearing retirement, the judge moved with the careful dignity of someone whose authority derived from years of fair and principled decisions rather than political connections or social status. "I came as soon as I heard about the complaint that's been filed," Judge Porter said, without preamble, as he settled into one of the chairs Daniel had crafted for their small parlor. "And I want you both to understand that this attack on your marriage is an attack on the rule of law itself." Emma appreciated the judge's directness, but she also understood the limitations of local support when facing accusations that fell under state and federal jurisdiction. "Can you help us fight this?" she asked. Judge Porter's expression was grave but determined. "I can do more than that. I can testify that I personally witnessed your marriage ceremony, that I verified your legal status at the time, and that no evidence of any previous marriage was presented during the proceedings. More importantly, I can help you understand what Victor is really trying to accomplish with these accusations." Daniel leaned forward, his attention focused completely on the judge's words. "What do you mean?" "Victor doesn't actually expect to prove you were previously married," Judge Porter explained. "He's counting on the legal process itself to destroy you financially and socially. Even if you ultimately prove your innocence, the investigation will take months or years, cost thousands of dollars, and create enough doubt about your character to damage your business and standing in the community." The strategy was diabolically clever in its simplicity. Victor had learned from his earlier failures that direct confrontation played to Emma and Daniel's strengths, allowing them to demonstrate their dignity and moral authority. But a prolonged legal battle would force them to exhaust their resources, defending against lies while he sat safely in the background, protected by his anonymity as the complainant. "There's something else you should know," Judge Porter continued. "Victor isn't acting alone this time. He's part of a broader effort by certain wealthy families to challenge what they see as the dangerous precedent of your marriage. They're concerned that other immigrants might follow your example, using marriage to gain citizenship and social standing." Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather. The implications of what the judge was describing extended far beyond her own circumstances to threaten every immigrant family trying to build better lives in America. If Victor and his allies succeeded in invalidating her marriage, they would establish a legal precedent that could be used to challenge other unions between immigrants and established Americans. "How many other families are at risk?" Daniel asked. "More than you might imagine," Judge Porter replied. "Marriage has become the most reliable path to citizenship for immigrant women, and certain elements in society are determined to close that path. Your case is being watched throughout Pennsylvania and beyond. The outcome will affect thousands of families who are counting on marriage to provide them with legal security." The weight of responsibility that settled on Emma's shoulders felt almost crushing. She had never asked to become a symbol or a test case for immigration policy. She had simply wanted to survive and build a decent life with a man who treated her with kindness and respect. But circumstances had made their personal happiness a matter of public policy, and the outcome of their legal battle would determine whether other women in desperate situations would have the same opportunities for escape and dignity. "We'll fight," Emma said, her voice carrying the same quiet determination that had sustained her through 5 years of challenges. "Not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us. Victor Ashford and his allies need to learn that they can't use the law as a weapon against people whose only crime is wanting better lives." Judge Porter nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the spirit you'll need. But you should understand that this fight will be different from anything you've faced before. Victor has learned from his mistakes, and he's prepared to wage a war of attrition that could last for years." The conversation continued through the afternoon as Judge Porter outlined the legal challenges ahead and provided letters of introduction to attorneys and officials in Philadelphia who might be sympathetic to their cause. But even with such support, Emma understood that they were facing opponents with virtually unlimited resources and powerful political connections who were determined to make an example of anyone who dared to challenge the established social order. That evening, as they sat by the fire in their comfortable parlor, surrounded by the furniture Daniel had crafted with his own hands, Emma found herself thinking about the girl she had been 5 years earlier. That desperate young woman on the courthouse platform could never have imagined that accepting Daniel's offer of marriage would eventually lead to a legal battle with implications for immigrant families throughout the country. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stepped forward that day?" Emma asked, as they watched the flames dance in the hearth Daniel had built from local stone. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire as if he could see the past and future dancing in its depths. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted, "but not in the way you might expect. I don't wonder if I made the right choice. I know I did. What I wonder about is whether I've done enough since then to justify the faith you've shown in me." The answer surprised Emma with its vulnerability. She had assumed that Daniel, with his quiet confidence and steady competence, never doubted the value of his contributions to their partnership. But she was beginning to understand that even the strongest people carried uncertainties about their worth and purpose. "You've given me more than faith," she said, reaching for his hand with the same natural gesture that had become one of their most reliable forms of communication. You've given me a life where I can be myself completely, where my thoughts and opinions matter, where I'm valued for who I am rather than what I can provide for someone else's convenience. That's a gift beyond price. Daniel's fingers tightened around hers, and Emma saw something shift in his expression, a relaxation of tension she hadn't realized he was carrying. I was afraid, he said quietly, that you might come to resent the complications my protection has brought into your life. Victor's attacks, the social pressure, now this legal challenge. Sometimes I think you might have been safer if you'd chosen a different path. Emma turned to face him fully, wanting him to see the absolute sincerity in her expression. Daniel Hayes, in 5 years of marriage, you have never once made me feel like anything less than an equal partner in everything we've built together. You've supported my desire to learn carpentry, encouraged me to speak my mind in public, trusted me with important business decisions. You've shown me what it means to be truly respected by another person. She paused, gathering her thoughts for words that felt too important to express carelessly. Victor Ashford wanted to buy me for $5 to use as he saw fit. You offered me marriage and citizenship, asking for nothing in return except the opportunity to share your life with someone who would appreciate your kindness. The choice was easy then, and it remains easy now, no matter what challenges we face. The conversation continued late into the night as they made final preparations for their departure to Philadelphia. They would leave Millbrook the following morning on the stagecoach, carrying with them all the documentation they could gather to support Emma's case, along with letters of support from community members who could testify to her character and the legitimacy of her marriage. But more importantly, they would carry with them the knowledge that their fight extended far beyond their personal happiness, to encompass the hopes and dreams of countless other families seeking the same opportunities for dignity and legal security that marriage could provide. The girl who had once stood on an auction platform waiting to be sold had become a woman whose courage and determination would help determine whether America would remain a place where people could escape the circumstances of their birth through their own efforts and choices. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crisp November air that seemed to crystallize everything it touched. Emma stood on the porch of the home she and Daniel had built together, looking out over the garden, where she had grown vegetables that fed their household and herbs that seasoned their meals. The chicken coop bustled with activity as the hens went about their morning routines, and smoke rose from the workshop where Thomas and the other apprentices would continue crafting beautiful furniture in their absence. It was a life worth fighting, for Emma realized, not just because of the material comfort and social standing they had achieved, but because it represented something larger and more important than individual success. Their home had become a place where people could visit and see proof that social barriers could be overcome, that love and mutual respect could triumph over prejudice and economic pressure, that ordinary people possessed the power to transform their own circumstances through courage and determination. Daniel emerged from the house carrying the leather satchel that contained their legal documents, his expression serious but not fearful. 5 years of facing challenges together had taught them both that problems could be solved through careful planning and persistent effort, even when the odds seemed overwhelming. "Ready?" he asked, offering her his arm with the same courtesy he had shown on their wedding day. Emma took one last look at the life they had built together, imprinting every detail in her memory against the possibility that they might not be able to return to it unchanged. Then she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and nodded with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced worse odds and emerged victorious. "Ready?" she said, and meant it completely. The stagecoach journey to Philadelphia took 2 days through countryside that was beginning to show the dormant beauty of approaching winter. Emma spent the time reviewing their legal strategy with Daniel and composing letters to her sisters who would need to be informed about the new challenges facing their family. Mary and Bridget, now free from their indenture contracts and working as paid employees for sympathetic families, had both married good men and established households of their own. Margaret continued to work in Philadelphia, but had saved enough money to send for young Nora, who was being educated at a convent school that prepared Irish girls for respectable employment. Catherine and Anne remained in more complicated circumstances, still bound by indenture contracts, but treated fairly by employers who'd been influenced by the legal scrutiny that followed Emma's marriage. All 6 sisters had found ways to build meaningful lives despite the traumatic separation that had scattered them across Pennsylvania, and their success stood as testament to the resilience and determination that had enabled the Sullivan family to survive the worst disasters that fate could arrange. Philadelphia in November bustled with the energy of a city that had become a beacon for immigrants seeking new opportunities in America. The streets teemed with people speaking a dozen different languages, pursuing trades and professions that would have been impossible in the rigid social hierarchies they had left behind in Europe. Emma found herself drawing strength from the obvious prosperity and happiness of families who had managed to establish themselves in this land of possibilities. Daniel's cousin James maintained offices in a substantial brick building near Independence Hall, where the founders of the American Republic had once debated the principles of freedom and equality that theoretically protected people like Emma from the kind of persecution Victor Ashford was attempting to perpetrate. James Hayes had grown into a distinguished attorney whose expertise in immigration law had made him wealthy enough to maintain both professional success and principled representation of clients who couldn't afford his usual fees. The reunion between the cousins was warm but quickly turned serious as James reviewed the accusations that had been filed against Emma's marriage. His initial assessment was both encouraging and sobering. While the charges were clearly false and motivated by personal vindictiveness, proving Emma's innocence would require extensive investigation and documentation that could take months to complete. The challenge, James explained as they sat in his private office surrounded by law books and legal precedents, is that you're being asked to prove a negative. Victor's accusation claims you were married in Ireland before coming to America, but he doesn't have to provide specific details about when or where this supposed ceremony took place. You, on the other hand, have to demonstrate that no such marriage ever occurred, which requires documentation from Ireland that may no longer exist. Emma felt a familiar frustration at the way legal systems seem designed to favor accusers over the accused, particularly when the accusers possessed wealth and social connections that ordinary people lacked. What kind of documentation would be sufficient? She asked. Ideally, we'd want baptismal records, parish marriage registers, testimony from clergy or community members who knew you in Ireland, James replied. But the potato famine disrupted record-keeping throughout the country, and many parishes lost their documentation during the chaos that followed. We may have to rely on circumstantial evidence and character testimony. Daniel leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. What about the original investigation that was conducted before our marriage? Judge Porter verified Emma's legal status at the time, and no evidence of any previous marriage was discovered then. James nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of procedural evidence that could help us. If the authorities had access to relevant records 5 years ago and found no impediment to your marriage, it suggests that Victor's current accusations are based on fabricated or misinterpreted information. The legal strategy began to take shape over several days of intensive preparation. James would challenge the accusations on procedural grounds, arguing that they should have been raised at the time of the original marriage, if they had any validity. He would also demonstrate that the anonymous complainant had provided no specific evidence to support his claims, suggesting that the accusations were motivated by personal animosity rather than genuine legal concerns. But the most powerful aspect of their defense would be the testimony of witnesses who could speak to Emma's character and the legitimacy of her marriage to Daniel. Judge Porter had already agreed to provide detailed testimony about the original ceremony and the investigation that preceded it. Mrs. Catherine Murphy would testify about Emma's conduct and reputation within the Irish community. Even some of the American families who had initially opposed their marriage would now speak in support of their right to remain together. The preparation process also revealed the extent of Victor Ashford's campaign against marriages between immigrants and established Americans. James had discovered similar accusations being filed against other couples throughout Pennsylvania, all following the same pattern of anonymous complaints, raising questions about the validity of unions that challenged traditional social boundaries. "This isn't really about you personally," James explained during one of their planning sessions. "You've become a test case for a broader effort to restrict immigration and limit the paths to citizenship that are available to newcomers. If Victor succeeds in invalidating your marriage, it will provide a precedent for challenging hundreds of other unions." The implications were staggering, and Emma felt the weight of responsibility that came with understanding how many other families were depending on the outcome of her legal battle. She thought about the young Irish women who were still arriving in American ports every week, hoping to find the same opportunities for dignity and security that her marriage to Daniel had provided. If those opportunities were eliminated, such women would be left with no alternatives except the kind of servitude that Victor Ashford had originally proposed for her. The hearing was scheduled for late December, giving James time to gather documentation and prepare witnesses while allowing Victor's attorneys to present whatever evidence they claimed supported their accusations. Emma and Daniel remained in Philadelphia during this period, staying with James and his family while contributing to the preparation of their defense. The time in the city also provided Emma with her first real opportunity to see how other immigrant families had managed to establish themselves in American society. She visited Irish neighborhoods where families had pooled their resources to buy property and start businesses, creating communities that preserved their cultural heritage while embracing American opportunities for advancement. She also met with representatives of immigrant aid societies who were working to protect newcomers from exploitation and abuse. These organizations had been following her case with great interest, understanding that the legal precedent it established would affect their ability to help other families escape poverty and discrimination. "Your courage in standing up to Victor Ashford has inspired immigrant women throughout the region," explained Mrs. Patricia O'Connor, who directed one of the largest aid societies in Philadelphia. "They see in your story proof that they don't have to accept whatever treatment powerful people choose to provide. You've shown them that dignity and legal protection are rights worth fighting for." The recognition was gratifying, but Emma also found it somewhat overwhelming. She had never intended to become a public figure or a symbol of immigrant rights. She had simply wanted to build a quiet life with a man who treated her with kindness and respect. But circumstances had thrust her into a position where her personal choices carried implications for thousands of other people, and she was determined not to disappoint those who were counting on her courage. The hearing itself took place in a federal courthouse that seemed designed to intimidate ordinary citizens with its marble columns and formal ceremonies. Victor Ashford attended with a team of expensive attorneys, his presence in the courtroom a reminder of the wealth and social connections aligned against Emma's cause. But James Hayes had assembled an equally impressive legal team, and the gallery was filled with supporters who had traveled from throughout Pennsylvania to witness the proceedings. The prosecution's case proved to be exactly as weak as James had predicted. Victor's attorneys presented no specific evidence of any previous marriage, relying instead on vague claims about irregularities in Emma's documentation and suggestions that her rapid acceptance of Daniel's proposal indicated guilty knowledge of some impediment to the union. In contrast, the defense presented overwhelming evidence of Emma's good character and the legitimacy of her marriage. Judge Porter's testimony about the original ceremony and investigation was particularly powerful, as was the documentation James had gathered from Irish parishes and government offices, confirming that no record of any previous marriage existed. But the most compelling testimony came from Emma herself, who spoke with the same direct honesty that had transformed the community meeting in Millbrook 5 years earlier. She described her childhood in Ireland, her family's struggle with poverty and starvation, the traumatic ocean crossing that claimed her mother's life, and the desperate circumstances that had led to her sisters being sold into indentured servitude. "I have never been married to anyone except Daniel Hayes," she stated clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "I accepted his proposal because it offered me dignity and legal protection that no other option provided. Our marriage has been built on mutual respect and shared partnership, and it represents everything that is best about American ideals of freedom and opportunity." She paused, looking directly at Victor Ashford as she continued. "The accusations against me are lies motivated by wounded pride and resentment that a poor Irish girl dared to reject the plans that a wealthy man had made for her. But this case is about more than personal grievances. It's about whether America will remain a country where people can escape the circumstances of their birth through their own efforts and choices." The judge's decision, announced after 3 days of deliberation, vindicated Emma completely and established important legal precedents that would protect other immigrant families facing similar challenges. Not only was her marriage to Daniel confirmed as completely valid, but the court also imposed financial penalties on those who had filed false accusations and established stricter standards for future challenges to immigrant marriages. More importantly, the decision sent a clear message that the American legal system would not tolerate the use of false accusations as weapons against people whose only crime was seeking better lives for themselves and their families. The precedent established by Emma's case would be cited in immigration law for decades to come, protecting thousands of families from the kind of persecution that Victor Ashford had attempted to perpetrate. The journey back to Millbrook felt like a victory parade, with supporters gathering at every stop to celebrate not just Emma and Daniel's personal triumph, but the broader principle that had been vindicated through their courage and determination. When their stagecoach finally pulled into Millbrook's town square, they found nearly the entire community waiting to welcome them home. Even some of the families who had initially opposed their marriage were present, having come to understand that Emma and Daniel's fight had been about fundamental American values rather than personal convenience. The unity displayed that December evening suggested that Millbrook had learned important lessons about the dangers of allowing prejudice and economic pressure to override basic human decency. Victor Ashford was notably absent from the celebration, and Emma later learned that he had left Millbrook permanently, rather than face the social consequences of his failed persecution campaign. His departure marked the end of an era of conflict and opened new possibilities for cooperation between immigrant families and established Americans who shared common values of fairness and mutual respect. The months that followed brought a period of unprecedented prosperity and happiness for Emma and Daniel. Their legal victory had generated publicity that brought customers from throughout the region seeking furniture crafted by the couple who had become symbols of American ideals. The workshop expanded again to accommodate demand, and they were able to hire additional apprentices while also establishing a fund to help other immigrant families facing legal challenges. But the most significant change was in Emma and Daniel's relationship itself. The shared ordeal of fighting for their right to remain together had deepened their bond into something that transcended the practical arrangement that had originally brought them together. They had become true partners in every sense, united not just by legal ceremony, but by tested commitment to each other's welfare and happiness. On their 6th wedding anniversary, as they sat in the parlor of the home they had defended so successfully, Emma reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment of contentment and security. The frightened girl who had once waited on a courthouse platform to be sold had become a woman whose courage had helped reshape American immigration law, whose partnership with a grieving widower had demonstrated the transformative power of mutual respect and genuine love. "Do you think we've made a difference?" she asked Daniel, as they watched snow fall past the windows, covering their garden and workshop in pristine white that seemed to promise new beginnings. Daniel considered her question with the same careful thoughtfulness he brought to all important matters. "We've proved that ordinary people can change their circumstances through courage and determination," he said finally. "We've shown that love can grow from the simplest acts of human decency, and we've established legal protections that will help other families build the kinds of lives we've been privileged to share." He paused, then continued with a smile that transformed his entire expression. "But most importantly, we've been happy together. Whatever else we've accomplished, we've created a life filled with purpose and contentment. That seems like difference enough for any two people to make." Emma reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers with the natural ease that had developed over years of facing challenges together. Outside, the snow continued falling, but inside their warm home, surrounded by furniture crafted with love and care, they sat in the peaceful silence of two people who had found exactly what they had been seeking, even if they hadn't known they were looking for it. The last daughter sold at auction had indeed found her home, not just in the house Daniel had built, but in the life they had created together through shared struggles and mutual devotion. Their story had become proof that sometimes the most extraordinary transformations begin with the simplest acts of kindness, performed by people who refuse to accept that circumstances of birth must determine the possibilities of life. In a world that often seemed determined to divide people by wealth, heritage, and social position, Emma and Daniel Hayes had demonstrated that love, respect, and determination could overcome any obstacle. Their marriage had become a beacon of hope for families throughout America who were seeking the same opportunities for dignity and advancement that Emma had found when Daniel stepped forward on that courthouse platform 6 years earlier. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.